Nietzsche, Cassirer, and Wittgenstein are not usually mentioned in the same breath. Nietzsche is probably the most gregarious philosopher of the three in terms of the kind of company that he keeps. There's this whole wealth of later interpretations about Nietzsche that shoots off in every direction. Nietzsche's influence moves with ease through different milieus. Nietzsche is mentioned alongside existentialists like Kierkegaard, psychoanalysts like Freud and Jung, postmodern thinkers like Foucault, vitalist thinkers like Goethe. Cassirer certainly draws upon the work of the German tradition, the German idealists, but he's more associated with Neo-Kantianism, particularly the Marburg School, and for better or for worse, he is usually mentioned along with Heidegger, with whom he had the infamous debate at Davos. And when it comes to Wittgenstein, he's associated with a completely different tradition, the analytic tradition, Russell, Frege, Moore, Ramsey, Ayer. Wittgenstein comes out of a movement in philosophy that attempts to set itself apart from the potentially endless disputes in ethics, aesthetics, and metaphysics that characterized the continental tradition, and that many among the analytic tradition considered to be a reflection of simply their linguistic confusion, more so than substantive disputes that could be resolved by argument. So while Wittgenstein is the new radical figure, Cassirer stands as the last representative of a dying breed of philosopher, the Kantian, liberal, humanist, in other words, the philosopher of the Enlightenment era. And meanwhile, Nietzsche stands as both the critic of the Enlightenment, of what Cassirer seems to represent, and as a consistent opponent of the theorizing and logicizing about the world that seems to characterize the analytic strand of philosophy. Among all the continental thinkers, Nietzsche would seem to be as stylistically opposed to that approach as one could possibly be. One may ask whether any of these three figures had any affinity for one another. Nietzsche obviously could not have known either of these two other men. He died before either one had reached maturity. And we find that both Cassirer and Wittgenstein read Nietzsche, but were often just as critical of him as they were admiring. And as regards one another, they might as well have been speaking different philosophical languages at that point. This is all to say that I'm more than willing to admit that this is an unlikely trio of philosophers to attempt to synthesize. But that's what we're going to do here, is try and synthesize a philosophical understanding out of all of them. My argument is certainly not that they form any sort of intellectual tradition, or that they should be seen as influencing one another. In fact, part of why I think this trio is so compelling when brought together is the very fact that they don't seem to be very much influenced by one another. And so they tend, in an uncanny way, to sort of fill in one another's gaps. And so we're going to focus specifically on the issue of language today, because this is where these three intersect in their thought most strongly, in my opinion, and hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll have sketched out an intelligible theory that weaves together all three views of language. We're going to begin with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is the first figure chronologically, and he also provides a strong starting point for understanding language. Perhaps the best place to begin with Nietzsche is in his aphorism in The Gay Science entitled On the Genius of the Species. In the beginning of this section, Nietzsche says that the problem, or the question of consciousness, arises most clearly when we consider what it would mean if consciousness were absent. If animate matter had never developed the process of depicting the world and the events and things within it and its own actions within that world, as it were within a mirror, Nietzsche says. And Nietzsche comes to the conclusion, following from what he says elsewhere about the consciousness as a kind of gloss or surface, that it seems to him that life could easily propagate itself without consciousness. Impulse can operate, it can manifest in the form of physiological movements and drives and give rise to actions, specifically such actions as finding nourishment and reproducing, those actions which characterize organic life, but it can do all this without depicting the world in its mirror. Why then did we create the mirror? Why should man be conscious? Nietzsche writes, quote, "Consciousness has developed only under the pressure of the need for communication. That from the start it was needed and useful only between human beings, particularly between those who commanded and those who obeyed, and that it also developed only in proportion to the degree of this utility. Consciousness is really only a net of communication between human beings. End quote. We've talked about this passage on the podcast in the past. I did a whole episode about it, in fact. But in this context, I want to focus on the following phrase: between those who commanded and those who obeyed. For Nietzsche, consciousness, understood here as a net of communication, finds its utility primarily in that it facilitates rank ordering. It facilitates the hierarchical organization of the organism on a social level. Now, even though Nietzsche defines consciousness this way, as serving the function of communication, we shouldn't be mistaken about what said communication consists of. That perhaps it's a authentic rendering of the inner content of the organisms, of the individual organisms made in a communicable way, because that's not what language has developed to do, at least not in the narrative Nietzsche's giving us here. It is used not to convey our depths, what is beneath the surface of consciousness, our inner sensations and thoughts, but rather to render in an exchangeable and universally understood form those thoughts and feelings that relate us to others on the social level. And therefore, the value of a communication, if we look at the kinds of communications that are going to be made on that level, that are going to be seen as, that are going to be selected for, right, as an adaptation, as serving this function. They're going to refer to our needs, our wants, the utterances that allow us to coordinate or motivate the actions of others, or any number of other activities such as warning others, advising others, teaching others, and so on. It's the communications that have the communal function. Cassirer puts it simply, quote, "Without speech there would be no community of men," end quote. So the signs we develop are meant to facilitate the group life of the organism, the herd life of the organism as Nietzsche would have had it. And thus these signs cannot communicate what is in the depths, or whatever the individual may think or feel that is not widely understood, or generally whatever's considered to be non-useful for the group life. Whatever we communicate with signs belongs to what Nietzsche calls our social or herd nature. Whatever rises to the surface of consciousness, and remember, consciousness is for him only a surface. That's the worst part of ourselves, or if not the worst, the most average, the most common ideas and experiences. Nietzsche continues, quote, "that our actions, thoughts, and feelings and movements enter our consciousness, at least a part of them, that is the result of a must that for a terribly long time lorded it over man. As the most endangered animal, he needed help and protection. He needed his peers. He had to learn to express his distress and to make himself understood. And for all of this, he needed consciousness. First of all, he needed to know himself what distressed him. He needed to know how he felt. He needed to know what he thought. For to say it once more, man, like every living being, thinks continually without knowing it. The thinking that rises to consciousness is only the smallest part of all this, the most superficial and worst part, for only this conscious thinking takes the form of words, which is to say signs of communication, and this fact uncovers the origins of consciousness. Add to this that not only language serves as a bridge between human beings, but also a mean, a pressure, a gesture, the emergence of our sense impressions into our own consciousness, the ability to fix them and, as it were, exhibit them externally, increased proportionately with the need to communicate them to others by means of signs. End quote. Nietzsche wrote these words late in his career when he revisited the gay science in 1887 and added a fifth book to the text. But even very early in his career, before his philosophical career had properly begun and he was still teaching at Basel, he wrote an essay called On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense. It was not published in his lifetime, but it's one of the single most illuminating bits of apocrypha for understanding the trajectory of Nietzsche's thought. In that essay, Nietzsche is trying to determine how it is that human beings could ever come to value truthfulness, He takes it as a starting premise that there is an overwhelming will to deception in human beings. How could this be overcome by a will to truth? This requires an understanding of what truth consists of, and Nietzsche concludes that we first begin to have a concept of truth at the moment when we begin to form these codes of signifiers, as Nietzsche is wont to speak of language as a kind of code. Wittgenstein makes an interesting point in Philosophical Investigations that almost reads like a defense of Nietzsche's position, though it must be said that it has to be understood as a defense of Wittgenstein's own assertions that words have meaning insofar as they have a use in particular language games that human beings play. But he writes in 241, posing first a rhetorical question to himself, quote, "So you are saying that human agreement decides what is true and what is false. What is true or false is what human beings say, and it is in their language that human beings agree. This is agreement not in opinions, but rather in form of life." End quote. So, after thousands of years of metaphysics, truth is often spoken of in philosophy as though it were a noun or something. But true or false is what human beings say. Wittgenstein's reflections on the meaning of language, these do not halt. His interrogation doesn't halt with the concepts true and false. These can only be sensibly comprehended within the context of human activities, these word concepts. We use them as part of what Wittgenstein will call forms of life. A language game embodies a form of life for Wittgenstein. The main problem, perhaps, with previous interpretations of language is that we always tend to approach language as though it can be merely understood as a system of conveying information. You know, as if the word concept is just providing us a picture of a fact in reality that it tries to objectively model. But this conception would be divorced from the realities of life that produce the language around which the language is constructed. It would be divorced from the kinds of activities that the language reflects and facilitates. So when human beings call a statement true or false, that is only comprehensible within an established code of signifiers. Both Nietzsche and Wittgenstein would agree on this point. I suppose Wittgenstein would add to Nietzsche's view, or he would sort of expand on Nietzsche's view by pointing out that the most various things can be done with these codes of signifiers, according to the kind of activity, the technique, or the objectives they're meant to serve. Perhaps Nietzsche's view is a bit too trapped in the primordial view of how language might have arisen, but Wittgenstein's model is perhaps more dynamic. He sees new language games arising all the time. It's a constantly developing, living thing. I'm not saying Nietzsche didn't understand this or didn't have an inkling of this. We could even see his task in philosophy as we could reinterpret Nietzsche's task, perhaps through Wittgenstein, as giving us a new language with which to speak of philosophy, right? But rarely does Nietzsche attempt to account for language outside of these sort of psychohistorical myths about the need for survival of early man, quote-unquote. Whereas Wittgenstein writes in Philosophical Investigations 23, quote, "There are countless different kinds of uses of all the things we call signs, words, sentences, and this diversity is not something fixed, given once and for all, but new types of language, new language games, as we may say, come into existence, and others become obsolete and get forgotten. The word language game is used here to emphasize that speaking of language is part of an activity, or of a form of life," end quote. So even our philosophical language, even our analytic philosophical language, that in itself is a game that we're playing. But even that understanding of it as a language game is part of the game of speaking about language. We wouldn't need to speak about language games unless we were playing the game of speaking about language. It can kind of put you in a weird headspace, but I think it's sensible what Wittgenstein is saying. That, therefore, when Wittgenstein writes in section 19 of Philosophical Investigations that, quote, "To imagine a language means to imagine a form of life," end quote, what he discusses immediately afterward is his hypothetical language of the builders. They have only 4 words: block, pillar, beam, and slab. The builder calls out the object needed. The assistant retrieves it. This language of only 4 words reveals to us a form of life, and that it discloses the activity for which the language is needed. A language reveals a horizon of possibilities for human life. There's, of course, that other famous saying from Wittgenstein that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Another particularly interesting passage is one in which Wittgenstein writes that to learn a technique is to learn a language. In other words, we should see our activities as producing languages, or as creative or as productive of languages. We can therefore understand the contextual languages that we have, the jargon, the shibboleths, and technical terms that we employ, as, again, a specific language game that discloses the technique, which is to say embodies the form of activity that the language expresses. Quote, to follow a rule, to make a report, to give an order, to play a game of chess are customs, usages, institutions. To understand a sentence means to understand a language. To understand a language means to have mastered a technique. End quote. As Nietzsche outlines in The Gay Science, given the imperiled nature of the human creature without social organization, one of his greatest weapons against the animals with claws and fangs against which he must compete is language itself. Human beings form their codes of signs in order to coordinate, and the truthful man is therefore the one who uses the code of signs in the usual way, and the way that facilitates the good of the community. The truthful man is praised because he makes the collective weapon of the human race against these fanged and clawed adversaries. He makes it function. The truthful man makes the weapon work. The community sanctions whatever language game is beneficial for its way of life, and it will discourage or prohibit any use of the signs in a way that violates the rules of the game for the individual's benefit, but the detriment of the community. Nietzsche writes, quote, that which henceforth is to be truth is now fixed. That is, a uniformly valid and binding designation of things is invented, and legislating language also yields the first laws of truth. Since here, for the first time, originates the contrast between truth and lie. The liar uses the valid designations, words, in order to make the unreal appear as real. E.g., he says, I am rich, whereas the right designation for his state would be precisely poor. He abuses the fixed conventions by convenient switching or even inversion of names. End quote. And so Nietzsche argues that it is not deception that man originally hates, but the deleterious effects to the community that follow from deception. It is only later that man will develop his opposition to lies as a kind of abstract moral standard independent of the consequences. And as we will touch upon later, this happens when the intelligible world, the mental world, the conceptual world, created by this high valuation of truth, comes to be enjoyed by mankind on its own terms. In the course of On Truth and Lies, Nietzsche makes a similar point as he makes in The Gay Science regarding the power that this code of signs gives to mankind. Quote, everything which makes humans stand out in bold relief against animals depends on this ability to volatilize perceptual metaphors into a schema, thus dissolving an image into a concept. For within the realm of those schemata, something becomes possible that never could succeed under the perceptual first impressions, to build up a pyramidal order with castes and grades, to create a new world of laws, privileges, suborders, delimitations, which now stands opposite the other perceptual world of first impressions, and assumes the appearance of being the more fixed, general, known, human of the two, and therefore the regulating and imperative one. End quote. So the perceptual world, what we frequently refer to as the phenomenal world, is defined by the largely fleeting and transient nature of those sense perceptions that make it up. We are stimulated here in a visual manner, there in an auditory manner, there in a tactile manner, and in another instance perhaps by an inner emotion or a memory. We might imagine an animal without consciousness, effectively turned in whatever direction the stimulus of the moment turns them. It's only when the perception can be made into a sign, and this perceptual metaphor, because the sign is itself a kind of metaphor for the thing it represents, then volatilized into a schema, a conceptual structure that relates these signs together, that man can begin to see the world as fixed and dependable. It's here that knowledge seems to become possible, because if the basis of knowledge is always changing, then what is true in one moment becomes false in the next, and there can be no enduring knowledge. That's the point of Socrates in, for example, Plato's Cratylus. It is not the perception or sensation of the moment to which the sign refers, but the concept of it, the general class of sensations or perceptions grouped under a sign, of which our knowledge is comprised. And within this fixed, determinate world of signs, we gain the ability to rank order. And that's where we're seeing the real, where the goods are delivered by this net of communication, at least in Nietzsche's view. This is what comprises the activity of valuing, the ability to set one thing above another, and therefore, eo ipso, to make an evaluation of worth within the context of a series of relations. Or we might say that evaluation of worth is what establishes the relation. When you say this is better than that relates the two things. They are in some sense one conceptual act. And once mankind begins to live and breathe within the cool air of this world of logical reflection and fixity, he begins to crave it above the world of the sensations. As Nietzsche says, it seems to be the more human world. And this sense of fixity and permanence, within this he also experiences. He experiences a sense of fixity not just in relation to things, but in relation to his own subjectivity. That is to say that he himself becomes fixed and permanent, or at least he's able to perceive himself this way, now within the conceptual schema, and therefore he becomes something which is reliable and can be regulated. And we might say, why would man desire that state? Shouldn't we want the wild, chaotic, free, truly free freedom of the natural world, right? But no, because within this, you gain a sense, therefore, of self-control, of freedom over base perception and impulse, not being turned by the stimulus, simply in an impulsive way. And it's this attraction to having control over one's self. That's how the will to deception is ultimately overcome for Nietzsche, because in this, man begins to value truth in itself independently of the social consequences, and to see lying as something categorically wrong rather than merely harmful or deleterious. And so he begins to value truth. The will to deception is overcome by the pleasure we take in seeing ourselves as fixed quantities. Now, this description of the cool, rarefied air of the conceptual world is echoed by Cassirer at the end of his essay, Language and Myth. He says that within words, within mythic images, the spirit can now move without hindrance, as though it is moving through a bright ether. And here he means spirit in that German sense, the mind, right? I mean, it does have a connotation that we shouldn't leave aside the connotations of the word spirit, but what he effectively sees is the intellect through this process that Nietzsche describes and that Cassirer will describe in different terms, which we'll discuss in a moment. Eventually, language building this discursive world of relations, of generalized knowledge, of classifying individual phenomena beneath the class concept. And it's within this world that the intellect, the mind, can move without hindrance. Quote, "This liberation is achieved not because the mind throws aside the sensuous forms of word and image, but in that it uses them both as organs of its own, and thereby recognizes them for what they really are, forms of its own self-revelation." End quote. But before we get on to bringing Cassirer into this synthesis, we have to understand exactly what is meant by this will to deception for Nietzsche in this context, because this is all very comparable to Cassirer's view of man as the symbolizing animal. Nietzsche argues that human beings, quote, "are deeply immersed in illusions and dream images. Their eyes glide only over the surface of things and see forms." Their sensation nowhere leads to truth, but contents itself with receiving stimuli and, so to say, with playing groping games on the back of things." End quote. Such a statement harkens back to the symbolic thinking of Goethe, who once told his friend Schiller in a famous argument between the two that he could apprehend ideas with his eyes alone as a kind of immediate perception. That when we see an object, like a plant, perhaps the best example to use in the case of Goethe, because he has this idea of the Urpflanze, the proto-plant, but we don't have to construct a plant out of the stem, the leaves, the blossom, and so on, or out of its particles or its inner workings. Rather, the phenomenon presents itself to us as a kind of directly perceptible form. Nietzsche, for his part, would argue that this is not a form proper to the object itself, but should be understood through the process of seeing, quote-unquote, as he describes it in this passage. That is to say, what we see is patterned by the eyes, by the visual cortex. And this, the same could be said for the other senses, right? This could also be applied to the other senses. The senses, we might say, are quote-unquote deceptive because they are creative, because they create these forms as organs of perception, because there is artistry, interpretation, even within the most basic sense perceptions. And Nietzsche writes, again speaking of mankind in general, quote, "Already it costs him some trouble to admit to himself that the insect and the bird perceive a world different from his own, and that the question which of the two perceptions of the world is more accurate is a quite senseless one, since to decide this question it would be necessary to apply the standard of right perception, i.e., to apply a standard which does not exist. On the whole, it seems to me that the, quote, right perception, which would mean the adequate expression of an object in the subject, is a non-entity full of contradictions. For between two utterly different spheres, as between subject and object, there is no causality, no accuracy, no expression, but at the utmost an aesthetical relation. I mean a suggestive metamorphosis, a stammering translation into quite a distinct foreign language, for which purpose, however, there is needed at any rate an intermediate sphere, an intermediate force, freely composing and freely inventing." End quote. What is that intermediate sphere, that intermediate force between us that establishes this purely aesthetical relation between subject and object, right? It's a very interesting way of putting it. Again, putting it in the language of language, so to speak, right? It's not translatable. You can't translate the object into subject. All we have is a sort of, what does he say, a stammering translation into a quite distinct foreign language. We can see in this essay the neo-Kantian perspective of the young Nietzsche, which is relevant, I would contend, for understanding his entire career. But in this respect, he shares a common philosophical ancestry with Cassirer, at least for a time. You could argue he kind of moves beyond neo-Kantianism in important ways later in his career. But at least as regards this question of how man forms the symbolic world in which he lives, there is a very important similarity to Cassirer. Cassirer writes in the chapter on language in his essay on man, quote, "If it were the task of human speech to copy or imitate the given or ready-made order of things, we could not avoid the conclusion that, after all, one of the two different copies must be the better. The one must be nearer to, the other farther from, the original. Yet, if we ascribe to speech a productive and constructive rather than a merely reproductive function, we shall judge quite differently. In this case, it is not the work of language, but its energy which is of paramount importance." End quote. So those two passages between Cassirer and Nietzsche are very similar, right? Because in both cases, they're talking about this idea of a ready-made objective world that we simply have to copy, perfectly translate into our own perception. And both raise the issue, Cassirer talks about, where he's talking about two different human languages, right? Like if there was this standard of correctness for conceptualizing the world, then we should be able to rank order the various languages of the world in terms of how well they're able to do this, right? And even that question is a bit absurd, and it's definitely would not be in fashion in today's world to sort of say that, well, English is obviously better than Spanish for modeling reality, but German's better than English, or Japanese is inadequate to the task. I don't think anyone would really be making these kinds of assertions, because it seems very obvious that no language actually, like, in spite of the fact that there are still these naive realists about reality, or these objectivists walking around who think this, I think we all implicitly agree at this point that this is not what language does, is try to approximate or correspond to a perfect system, that perhaps the perfect language would be a kind of mathematical series of formulas, right? It would be analytical philosophy. That would be the perfect language, right? How abhorrent of a theory. Nietzsche does it with different species, right? He says, well, the bird sees things differently than us. The worm sees things differently than us. Animals with different organs are going to have a different perception. Which one's the right one? Well, that assumes this standard that you can measure them by, which doesn't exist. So as Cassirer says, language is not a workshop faithfully reproducing copies of the objective world, whose true form, quote unquote, comes to us ready-made, where the only issue is the poor craftsmanship of our organs at copying it. That's not how Cassirer sees the issue at all. He sees not the work of language, but its energy, what it's able to do, its potential. And he invokes the term the order of things, which I think we should think back to what Nietzsche said, the pyramidal order that relates all these signs for various phenomena in terms of their rank value, right? That's something that we create. It's not something that we receive from outside. I could, of course, quote from Nietzsche's many sayings once we get into his writings on morality and on values, how man did not receive his values, he didn't discover them, they didn't come from the lap of being or from heaven. We had to create all of our values. But what does that mean? It means that there is a creative aspect of our organs of perception that creates this pyramidal order of relations, that volatilizes these perceptions, which might just be fleeting things, into a conceptual schema, into a system. And remember that in Language and Myth, Cassirer argues that discursive reasoning proceeds by ever more generalizing knowledge, by relating every fact to every other fact, right? Nietzsche would insist that requires the rank ordering, as we've already somewhat discussed. But to return to Cassirer, if we don't look to the work of language, but its energy, its potential, the possibilities for the use of language, we find that language creates, it constructs, it produces this sign code, this code of symbols, as Cassirer would have it, for the interpretation of the world out of the artistry of the senses. It's not making copies of the objective world. No such world exists, no such standard exists. That would be the world in itself, the thing in itself, which we cannot cognize, whereas the symbolic world that language deals with is a creative production. Wittgenstein can also be brought into agreement on this point. He writes in Philosophical Investigations number 90, quote, "We feel as if we had a right to see right into phenomenon, yet our investigation is directed not towards phenomena, but rather, as one might say, towards the possibilities of phenomena. What that means is that we call to mind the kinds of statements that we make about phenomena. Our inquiry is therefore a grammatical one." End quote. Wittgenstein makes clear what I would consider to be an operating premise of all three thinkers, that the symbolic world of language is not to be equivocated with the phenomenal world. Even as we may also say of the phenomenal world that it's creatively shaped by our organs of perception, language, which is the transference of that perception into the symbol, it's yet another degree of removal. And so when we investigate language and its possibilities, what we can possibly say within our language games, Wittgenstein says we're not seeing right into phenomena, as perhaps some philosophers believe we are by studying the words of men. For Wittgenstein, we always have to refer back to context and use in order to understand what the language is doing. Where all three are in accord, then, is that the word concept cannot be understood by reference to the quote-unquote objective world as a kind of blueprint or standard. That's not what we're working with when we are working with language. We're working with something that relates back to human perception and indeed human possibilities, human activities. The symbol is a kind of energy that we use. Again, to use Cassirer's framing, it's not simply, it's not a factory churning out copies. This is why the neo-Kantians, such as von Helmholtz, often entertained thought experiments on the subject of what would reality be to a being with different organs of perception from ourselves. And Nietzsche puts this type of consideration quite powerfully in On Truth and Lies. Quote, "If each of us still had for himself a different sensibility, if we were ourselves only able to perceive sometimes as a bird, sometimes as a worm, sometimes as a plant, or if one of us saw the same stimulus as red, another as blue, if a third person even perceived it as a tone, then nobody would talk of such an orderliness of nature, but would conceive of her only as an extremely subjective structure. What is a law of nature for us? It is not known in itself, but only in its effects, that is to say, in its relations to other laws of nature, which again are known to us only as sums of relations. Therefore, all these relations refer to one another and are absolutely incomprehensible to us in their essence." End quote. This kind of thought experiment on the part of Nietzsche, what if we all perceived the world of sensations like differently? Even, one sees a color as red, the other is blue, the other hears it as a sound, right? Your perception shifts from different ways of modeling reality that might be different given to you might say, the aesthetical tastes of the organs of the bird or the worm or the human being. Wittgenstein does very many similar kinds of thought experiments. He entertains similar thought experiments in his philosophical investigations concerning the possibilities that different forms of sensation could possibly be experienced very differently for different subjects. And oftentimes Wittgenstein poses such possibilities. In my reading, in order to suggest that the use of language can operate independently of different sensations, being independently verified by others, right? That after all, we don't know what another person sees as red, only the sign they use. The sign for the color red doesn't actually depend on us having the same subjective experience for that person in order for it to be useful. And that this verification thesis on how words can be anchored as meaningful, that a meaningful sentence is one which can be verified, in fact falls apart when we try to apply that principle to statements about one's own pain or just statements about the ways that one sees the world. There's no way to verify these claims, and yet the words are still useful, they're still meaningful. But I want to bring in another fragmentary work by Wittgenstein, his philosophy of psychology. And this work, I think I'm correct about this, was originally the second volume of Philosophical Investigations, I think, or it was packaged together with it, when in fact they were originally meant to be two different bodies of work, so to speak, because they were both kind of disjointed, fragmentary collections of notes or aphorisms at the end of the day. But in Philosophy of Psychology, he poses some questions very similar to Nietzsche in On Truth and Lies, particularly Nietzsche's skepticism toward the attempt to find solid ground with the laws of nature. Wittgenstein asks in 365, quote, "If concept formation can be explained by facts of nature, shouldn't we be interested not in grammar, but rather in what is its basis in nature?" End quote. And for Wittgenstein, in some sense, that's simply a question beyond the scope of his inquiry. He says it's a question for natural science, and he's not doing natural science. It's not even a question of natural history, he says, because we can invent fictitious natural histories for our own purposes. In fact, this is arguably just what Nietzsche does. To some extent, maybe Cassirer, even though he's a bit more grounded in empiricism than Nietzsche. Nietzsche's more than willing to, in the style of Hegel, just give us these psychohistorical myths that, you could easily sort of be critical of. But the point is to produce helpful conceptual schemata for understanding the genealogy of human cognition. And so it may appear at the outset of these types of considerations in philosophy of psychology that Wittgenstein is somewhat at variance with Nietzsche and Cassirer here, and that might be the case. I'm not trying to smooth over differences. After all, Wittgenstein's not really interested in a genealogical analysis. He is interested in the everyday uses of language. We need to stop thinking up these complex explanations and metaphysics, and perhaps he might have even included genealogies, and instead look to the game that's actually being played, what's actually happening, how the words are actually being used. But I nevertheless think that these positions are reconcilable. To Wittgenstein's question, we may respond that we cannot investigate laws of nature as some objective basis for concept formation for the precise reason that Nietzsche lays out. What is a law of nature for us? We do not encounter it, quote unquote, in itself, but rather in our perception of it. And in fact, in the following section of the Philosophy of Psychology 366, Wittgenstein continues in a rather interesting manner, quote, I am not saying if such and such facts of nature were different, people would have different concepts, in the sense of a hypothesis. Rather, if anyone believes that certain concepts are absolutely the correct ones, and that having different ones would mean not realizing something that we realize, then let him imagine certain very general facts of nature to be different from what we are used to, and the formation of concepts different from the usual ones will become intelligible to him, end quote. And so, to paraphrase Wittgenstein here, to attempt to bridge these interpretations between Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, my argument would be this. Perhaps, if we were to... These people who think that certain concepts are absolutely the correct ones are the type of people who believe in a ready-made order of things that our language merely copies, as Cassirer says. And let him imagine, then, very general facts of nature to be different to what we are used to, so perceived in a different way, modeled in a different way. Perhaps, as Nietzsche says, if we at one time attained the perspective of a bird, at another that of a worm, at another that of a plant, for example. And even if we don't actually, even if we're not able to have this experience of possessing the perspective of a bird or a worm or a plant, or the requisite organs of those animals and their conceptual structures that they would create, whatever they might be, we can imagine certain general facts of nature as they would be experienced differently by beings with different means of perceiving. And through this, we can understand the necessities behind the concepts that we form of the external world, as a consequence of the differing perception of the laws of nature made possible by these specific organs that we possess. So the concepts and the metaphors that we use for talking about objects, events, facts in the world, they must be understood through the sense of contingency, not as absolute facts, not as giving us the right to see right into phenomena. When we speak of metaphors, conceptual metaphors as the basis of the code of signs, all three would argue that the metaphorical activity occurs first and foremost as the representation of a person, physical object, event, a deity, even an idea, its representation in the form of a sound. All three of them speak of this translation, right, from sound into image. The translation of an experience or a perception into a vocal expression or interjection. And then a second metaphorical transference occurs when we bring to mind a picture in accordance with someone making the right combination of sounds and syllables. Now, as we discussed in the episodes on Wittgenstein, for early Wittgenstein, the concept he has of how this happens is much neater. It's much simpler that we have this transference from sound to image to the mental picture. Rather, a series of sounds produces a picture. But later Wittgenstein, his innovations, again, make this view of language much more dynamic. He doesn't fully abandon it, but the pictorial theory of language is now considered as merely one of language's possibilities. He says that if a picture forms, that's not necessarily the point of the language game. Further, the question is how we use the picture, which is not determined by the picture itself, but again, the form of life it's embedded within. See Philosophical Investigations number 195. Quote, you need to think of the role which pictures such as paintings, as opposed to working drawings, play in our lives. This role is by no means a uniform one, a comparison. Proverbs are sometimes hung on the wall, but not the theorems of mechanics, our attitude to these two things, end quote. So again, part of language is giving us a picture, is the transfer between sound and image. But for Wittgenstein, We simply can't end the story there. It's all about what we do with the picture. And so, again, I think this is deeply commensurate with all of these thinkers. It's all about the activity. It's all about for Nietzsche, coordination, the command, the rank ordering. For Cassirer, the symbolizing and facilitating the community of man. Wittgenstein, as I said, perhaps makes it a bit more dynamic, but it's all about what you do with it, right? So I wanted to get that, touch upon that again before we delve deeper into Cassirer in this context. Because again, that very act of transference, right, that requires a radical metaphor. The radical metaphor is what Cassirer sees as the deep problem confronting all those who approach language. Wittgenstein has his own set of critiques of those who have approached language. But for Cassirer, we can't even get to the problem of how the picture is used, that is, to understand the picture within the form of life that the language game embodies, until we understand how a picture could even be produced. In other words, for Wittgenstein, if he's just looking to how language functions in the present day, in the everyday use, and takes it for granted that functionally language can use sounds to evoke pictures, it may seem like kind of a simple thing. We can see Cassirer as basically coming in, whereas Wittgenstein problematizes or forces us, challenges us to expand our idea of what we do with these word pictures. Cassirer problematizes and challenges us to give more attention and focus to understanding how such a thing could have ever come about, because it's such a great leap. And after all, as the common saying goes, nature does not make leaps, so how could such a thing happen? Hermann Usener, whose work guides Cassirer's own forays into language, said, quote, "The chasm between specific perception and general concepts is far greater than our academic notions, and a language which does our thinking for us lead us to suppose. It is so great that I cannot imagine how it could have been bridged, had not language itself, without man's conscious awareness, prepared and induced the process." End quote. Cassirer puzzles over this in both his essay on man and his work Language and Myth, and comes to the conclusion that metaphorical transference really is the fulcrum of language, we might put it, the cognitive innovation that sets the entire project in motion. But he thinks that an explanation of like where we found the impetus for this process has not been forthcoming, nor has it been adequately explored. Really, the only one among his predecessors that he thinks might have explored this is Humboldt, or indeed Usener. In any case, Nietzsche's words in On Truth and Lies, in the non-moral sense, give voice to the same fascination with this transference from different sensory spheres, and even from the sensory into the cognitive, by means of a kind of radical metaphor, of the specific thing coming to stand for a class concept. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Different languages placed side by side show that with words it is never truth, never adequate expression that matters, for otherwise there would not be so many languages. The thing in itself, it is just this which would be the pure truth without effects, is quite incomprehensible to even the creator of language and is utterly unworthy of striving. He designates only the relations of things to humans, and for their expression he calls to his help the most daring metaphors. A nerve stimulus, first transformed into an image. First metaphor. The image is then imitated by a sound. Second metaphor. And each time a complete leap from one sphere into the midst of another new one." End quote. So Nietzsche makes the same argument, he draws on the same sort of illustrative example as Cassirer does in the passage we looked at earlier, that when we compare two human languages side by side even, we see that it can't be considered as a matter of the truth, of adequate expression of the truth. At least not in the sense of the truth as the depiction of the objective world in our mirror, as it were, that the mirror of the subject's consciousness could depict the mind-independent world of the Kantian thing in itself. Instead, our perceptual systems and the metaphors they generate designate things as they relate to the human. And somehow, however, but we come back to this issue, right? We've managed to transfer the nerve stimulus into a sound, and from that into an image, which fixes and binds it. And then the final notion would be to use that as a concept. And the process can also work in reverse, right? A concept can conjure an image, which can then that image can then cause you to utter a sound, right? The word that refers to the image. And then another person hears your utterance of that word as a stimulus, right? Stimulating their auditory organ, the ear. And so it works in forward and backward, right? And all of these translations, as again Nietzsche says, they're utterly untranslatable spheres, right? So how do we do this? We've already discussed Cassirer's theories following from Usener and Codrington's philological or anthropological work. We discussed that in the previous episode. But here, I'm kind of approaching this episode as a synthesis for someone who might not have heard of Nietzsche or Wittgenstein or Cassirer's theories of language, and so that they can get the whole thing in this presentation. So I'm going to give the short version of the mythological development that occurs in tandem with language as Cassirer sees it. At least I'll convey the parts that I think are necessary for understanding the argument here. Cassirer sees the development of language and myth as two shoots springing from the same stem, the same root. Mythic thinking and language are united in their activity of naming, and against the backdrop of the most primordial form of religiosity, which does not differentiate between distinct gods or spirits, but sees only a sort of indeterminate demonic power as manifesting in certain places, people, or things, what is called the mana-taboo complex. Out of this, mankind eventually reaches the stage of naming what Cassirer and Usener call momentary gods. They are described by reference to, for example, the tro, a word used by the Eva tribe, in which anything which strikes the individual as powerful or which saves his life or fills him with fear or numinous feelings is called a god. And this god, however, is bound to a specific moment and place because it is, in a sense, created out of this subjective state. The act of naming, the radical metaphor in which the sound comes to designate, the sound becomes a sign for something, Cassirer believes occurs in the absolute condensation of one's attention in this experience, this numinous experience. Cassirer's theory hinges on his understanding of word magic, the magical mode of thinking, in which the sign that stands for the phenomenon literally is the phenomenon, and the way one may attempt to summon the rain by pouring out water to invite the rain to fall in a similar fashion in certain rituals, or the way in which we might think of like in Voodoo or certain traditions, right? You might try to curse somebody after obtaining some of their hair or some part of their person, their fingernails. The operating principle here is that the part itself is the whole. There is an absolute identity between them. The fascinating aspect of Cassirer's theory is that he sees our whole logical discursive world, these uses for language in which we expand beyond the individual phenomena, the subjective experience, right, that condenses everything. We expand beyond that and relate things to a whole system of understanding, but it requires, as its foundation, this absolute condensation and intensification. The entire external world is consumed, quote unquote, by one single perception that dominates the whole attention. And within this experience, one's spontaneous utterances, right, they're in spontaneous interjections. Perhaps that becomes the name of the momentary God, because it is the thing that's uttered in its presence, and everything that happens in this experience with the momentary God becomes part of the same indivisible whole. It's all compounded into one thing. Cassirer writes, quote, "The conscious experience is not merely wedded to the word, but is consumed by it. Whatever has been fixed by a name, henceforth is not only real, but is reality. We find a relation of identity, of complete congruence between image and object, between name and thing." End quote. This question is important for Cassirer because naming always seems to draw attention to one property or another. For example, the Greek word for the moon, which refers to the moon as the measurer, the measure of time, right? That's how we're to name the moon. That's the important quality, versus the Latin word which refers to its brightness, or its clarity, its luminosity. Any number of properties or qualities of a phenomenon could be emphasized. So it's not enough to simply say that our words denote some aspect of the object. But we have to ask why our attention is directed to one aspect, one property, one quality, and not to all the others. Cassirer writes, quote, "Our problem is not the choice of properties already given, but the positing of the properties themselves. It is to comprehend and illuminate the nature and direction of, quote, noticing, which must precede mentally the function of denoting, end quote. And one of the things Cassirer says is that somebody could say this sounds like a negative process, because in a way you're cleaving away the whole world in the thrall of one experience. You're in some sense possessed by it, right? That's why this is the language of spirit possession is very important here. You're sort of possessed by the experience. You zero in your focus. It's condensed to one quality, one thing that takes up the whole of reality. But Cassirer says this isn't a negative experience. It's positive. It's creative. It creates the ability to grab hold of something, right, against the chaotic roil of what might be the chaos of all the possible perceptions or experiences that you could focus on. So we have to have this basis of what we notice in order to grab hold of anything at all and designate a quality that can then become this fixed thing, right? And after man has designated the momentary God, he proceeds through these several successive stages. Next, he develops the special God, the God of a certain function or activity, a God that does not exist only in one place or in a particular moment, but governs an activity, any routinely recurring event in human life. The special gods are not the momentary demons who come and go, quote, appearing and dissolving like the subjective emotions from which they arise, end quote. But rather, Cassirer makes an assertion that would be quite congenial with the position of Wittgenstein, that it's new activities, new forms of life that produce new ways of speaking, that actually drive along the development of new ways of designating concepts, new ways of conceiving of concepts. So the special gods, such as the agricultural deities, that rule over not only one harvest and one field, but over harvesting in general, originate, quote, not from spontaneous feelings, but from the ordered and continual activities of mankind. As intellectual and cultural development progresses, our relation toward the outer world changes proportionately from a passive to an active attitude, end quote. So with the change in the form of life, we get a shift in language, and at this point, as Cassirer would have it, we get a shift in the kind of mythic thinking that predominates in our worldview that accompanies our language. The final phase is the personal God, in which perhaps shifts in language, the importation of loan words and so on, produce a situation in which the name of a god, like one of the special gods over an activity, is no longer the same word for the activity itself. And the god begins to be seen as possessing its own essence or nature aside from the activity. That's still his domain, but the gods become entirely objectified, begins to be conceptualized as a personality who can now act, feel, and suffer. And beyond this, there's monotheism, which is very interesting, but if you want to learn more about this, you can go to the previous episode where we talked about this, because it doesn't relate as much to this synthesis of these three theories of languages. What interests us here in weaving together these three theories is the sense of the word originally representing a kind of subjective expression. It is originally an exclamation, an utterance that is defined by a fleeting emotion. This is how Cassirer accounts for the metaphorical transference, by reference to that concept of word magic. The name is the thing, the attention is fixed on a certain property by the powerful subjective experience, but once the sign has been given and the name comes into use, it becomes exchangeable. The speakers come to experience the sign as indicating something quite external from their own subjective emotional states. The emotionality that originally accompanied the name, that gave birth to the name, steadily is debased. It wears down. Nietzsche also uses the metaphor of debased coinage, but it's steadily deprived of its emotional content. Cassirer writes in Language and Myth, quote, if such a God is in his origin the creation of a moment, if he owes his existence to some entirely concrete and individual never-recurring situation, he yet achieves a certain substantiality, which lifts him far above this accidental condition of his origin. Once he has been divorced from the immediate exigency, the fear or hope of the moment, He becomes an independent being, which henceforth lives on by a law of its own, and has gained form and continuity. He appears to men not as a creature of the hour, but as an objective and superior power which they adore, in which their cult endows with more and more definite form. End quote. So thus far, what Cassirer has said may seem to be only explanatory of the development of mythic thought. But immediately after this paragraph, he raises the stakes by tying this development explicitly to language. Quote, "The same function which the image of a god performs, the same tendency to permanent existence, may be ascribed to the uttered sounds of language. The word, like a god or demon, confronts man not as a creation of his own, but as something existent and significant in its own right, as an objective reality. As soon as the spark has jumped across, as soon as the tension and emotion of the moment has found its discharge in the word or the mythical image, a sort of turning point has occurred in human mentality. The inner excitement, which was a mere subjective state, has vanished and has been resolved into the objective form of myth and speech. And now an ever-progressive objectification can begin. In the same measure in which the autonomous activity of man extends over a widening sphere and becomes adjusted and organized within that sphere, his mythical and verbal world undergoes a progressive organization of ever more definite articulation." End quote. And yet again, we can draw the connection to Wittgenstein here, right? From Cassirer's claim that it's man's autonomous activity expanding over a wider and wider sphere. That's the nature of man's activity. That's what adjusts and organizes his verbal world. But even more interesting in this context, to me, is the connection with Nietzsche. And it's one that's not just a matter of content, but also diction and just the way of speaking about it. Because long ago, when I was first reading Cassirer, I noticed this similarity. In the way that Cassirer speaks of the subjective state that produces the word, slowly disappearing, opening up the possibility for the word concept, the sign to be used in a quote-unquote objective manner. In other words, designating something existent that stands apart from man's own subjective experience of it, I noticed that similarity to the way that Nietzsche speaks of it On Truth and Lies. And so let's compare what Nietzsche says there. He writes, quote, "Let us consider especially the formation of concepts. Every word immediately becomes a concept, not by having to serve as something of a memory of the unique and utterly individualized original experience to which it owes its origin, but by having at the same time to fit innumerable more or less similar, that is, strictly speaking, never equal, therefore altogether unequal, cases. Every concept originates through equating the unequal. As certainly as no one leaf is exactly similar to any other, so certain is it that the concept leaf has been formed through an arbitrary omission of these individual differences, through a forgetting of the differentiating qualities, and it awakens the notion that in nature there is besides the leaves a something that would be, quote, leaf, a sort of primal form from which all leaves were woven, drawn, marked out, colored, crinkled, painted, but by unskilled hands, so that no copy had turned out correct and trustworthy as a true copy of the primal form." End quote. We may again think of Goethe and his theory of the Urphenomenon, specifically the Urpflanze, the protoplant, the original or ideal plant, we might say. This is what the concept consists of, a kind of metaphor for a class of things that equalizes the unequal insofar as no individual instantiation of the concept matches its blueprint perfectly. Now, Nietzsche would argue this is a beneficial thing. This is an advantage we have, right? That this is the form that our eye creates as part of its activity of seeing. Cassirer would point out how this condensation of zeroing in on one quality which is named, such that we can then abstract that quality and identify it, whether or not it occurs in an absolutely equal form, but that class concept of the quality, that's incredibly useful, right? That's the beginning of our symbolizing activity, which creates this conceptual world. That's the foundation of that whole system of relations. And so it may be incorrect, if we're still doing this sort of objective world thing, this absolute standard for truth thing, but what Nietzsche has said about the formation of concepts, the word becomes a concept when it ceases to serve as the memory of unique and utterly individualized original experience, which is the word's origin. It's like he's describing Cassirer's momentary gods and the process of objectification that the word then undergoes as man's forms of life change and develop. So even though all conception equalizes the unequal, we might ask, what would remain of the world without our eyes that gloss over things and see forms? As we've already mentioned, Cassirer sees man as the animalis symbolicum, the symbolizing animal. That's what makes us distinctly human. And so Nietzsche writes that we modern types, who are accustomed to use language in its logical and discursive form, quote, will scarcely believe that the concept too remains only as the residue of a metaphor, and that the illusion produced by the artistic metamorphosis of a nerve stimulus into images is, if not the mother, then the grandmother of every concept, end quote. This is why people will resist these theories of language, right? Because they would seem to make the basis of all of our rational conception of the world, this artistic, irrational metaphor that makes this radical leap of the nerve stimulus into the image, and the image into the class concept. In one of the most famous passages in On Truth and Lies, Nietzsche calls truth a mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. But hopefully by now the sense of what he's saying there will not be interpreted as, people have interpreted all sorts of things into that essay, these simplistic claims that Nietzsche is simply saying, language is meaningless, nothing is true or false, things like this. But again, without these metaphors and anthropomorphisms, what would the world be for us? As Nietzsche told us earlier, quote, between two utterly different spheres, as between subject and object, there is no causality, no accuracy, no expression, but at the utmost an aesthetical relation, end quote. So we require that mediating process in order to bring the jumble of momentary perceptions into that order of rank in which commands can be issued, evaluations of worth can be made. This mediating process is precisely the metaphorical thinking itself, which makes possible the entire project of symbols and linguistic communication. And for Nietzsche, therefore, is what makes consciousness useful and therefore possible. But the metaphorical thinking, which is part and parcel with magical thinking, thereby appears like a sort of a magma flow, and our conceptual world, our code of signs, represents the hardening and cooling of that magmatic process. Nietzsche writes, quote, only by forgetting that primitive world of metaphors, only because the original mass of similes and precepts pouring forth as a fiery liquid out of the primal faculty of human fancy has become hard and rigid, only by the invincible faith that this sun, this window, this table is a truth in itself, in short, only by the fact that man forgets himself as subject, and what is more, as an artistically creating subject, only by all this does he live with some repose, safety, and order, end quote. And it's in that sense of living in a fixed, orderly existence that Nietzsche thinks that's what propels what Cassirer calls this process of successive objectification. Cassirer is much more fixated on how we make that radical leap that puzzled Usener so much, right, from the specific to the general class concept, that I would say he doesn't spend as much time as Nietzsche does, for example, seeing how this successive objectification develops. But they both see the metaphor as the key aspect of language's workings. It makes possible that objectification that later takes place, that eventually gives rise to what Cassirer would call the functional unity of language. Cassirer writes, quote, the true unity of language, if there is such a unity, cannot be a substantial one. It must rather be defined as a functional unity. Such a unity does not presuppose a material or formal identity. Two different languages may represent opposite extremes, both with respect to their phonetic systems and to their parts of speech systems. This does not prevent them from accomplishing the same task in the life of the speaking community. The important thing here is not the variety of means, but their fitness for and congruity with the end, end quote. The unity is to facilitate the social life of man, the functional unity. And again, all three of these thinkers are largely agreed, although Nietzsche would say we're always reinterpreting and resubjugating phenomena to our own needs in the present, right? So maybe that language doesn't have to have that functional unity of facilitating the social life of man. Nietzsche is very suspicious of this idea of ends, and yet we must admit that his meditations on Truth and Lies and in The Genius of the Species are looking at, for example, communication as the end of consciousness, right? And why? For its social utility. So he's willing to tarry with these ideas, even if I think Nietzsche, like Wittgenstein, is often trying to make things perhaps more complicated. And all three of these thinkers have different assessments of the meaning or the worth of the social life of man, or its importance, its significance. This is what is expressed when Cassirer says that the community's existence is based on language, or when Wittgenstein says a form of life is embodied in language. They all agree on this point, but we might say between somebody like Nietzsche and, frankly, either of these other two thinkers, whether or not fostering the herd nature of man is a good thing or a bad thing, they come to very different conclusions. It is here when we should bring in Wittgenstein's arguments against a private language. For Wittgenstein, there's no such thing as a private language, here meaning a truly private system of communication that only exists to convey concepts that are known by one person, perhaps as inner states for which the rest of society has no word. Perhaps he experiences a novel sensation no one's ever heard of. Wittgenstein argues that it doesn't seem you could establish a language on this basis. When one relies on their own inner states in order to bound a concept, for one, the sign would be useless because it would be incommunicable, but secondly, the subject would quickly find himself unable to group sensations under this private word concept, because he'd have no objective standard of comparison, no criterion for identifying his private sensations, other than the fleeting feelings of the moment. Owing to our fallible memory, the fallible memory of mankind, we would be unable to remember if what we were feeling at a given moment were actually our unique private sensation, or perhaps if that sensation were something slightly different. There's no criterion of judgment, right? Inward states are in need of outward criteria, which we do not have. Wittgenstein's arguments on private language primarily hinge on the idea that language simply doesn't attempt to convey subjective states, or to the extent that it does so in a way that is useful or has a meaning in the context of the broader language game, and it has a public meaning, right? For these communications which would have no public meaning, only a private meaning, would be incommunicable. So there are ways that we talk about our inner states. We discussed this in the second episode on Wittgenstein. But it's not insofar as it serves as a verification of, or depends on a knowledge of their inner states. We don't have to verify their inner states. We don't have to know that someone's pain is the same as our pain in order to talk about pain, do things with the word pain. So, for example, Wittgenstein writes, quote, "Ask yourself, on what occasion, for what purpose do we say this? What kinds of actions accompany these words? Think of a greeting. In what kind of setting will they be used and what for?" End quote. For Wittgenstein, it's sensible to speak of such things as one's pain as part of the language game. In other words, the sentence, "I have a toothache," is a useful thing to communicate because of the actions and the setting in which it is embedded. So, you say you have a toothache when you're going to the dentist, or if you're getting sympathy from friends, or you're calling into work, all of these things. The word has a use. And we don't need to know the person's inner experience. We don't even need to know their intentions. Again, we can speak of inner experience and intentions within the language game, but the meaning is not, again, to refer to, as Cassirer and Nietzsche have been saying, to refer to this ready-made world that the language merely copies. That's not the case with our inner experience, as with everything else, right? In fact, quote, "An intention is embedded in a setting, in human customs and institutions," end quote. So that was Wittgenstein, sorry. Forget I should be very clear about who I'm quoting when I'm quoting from three different people. But it's these customs and institutions that serve as the backdrop, or we might say the playing field of every game we engage in. In every case, a knowledge of the subjective experience of the person in pain is not necessary, and it's not what is communicated. To the extent that one's intentions are important, it might be within the context of specific language games. But of course, we can never know intentions. We can only judge actions. We can only make statements about intentions, about our own and about the intentions of others. Quote, language is an instrument. Its concepts are instruments, end quote. It's also Wittgenstein. And given Nietzsche's comments in The Gay Science, we can say that he would certainly agree with Wittgenstein on this point. We often say, that it was the use of tools that allowed us to overcome the natural world of all these animals who have natural weapons, right? Well, language is our weapon, language is our tool, language is our instrument. These considerations so far should not leave you with the impression that this synthetic theory which we've produced must operate by reducing mankind's uses of language into a series of successive stages that require a progression to what might be called the more accurate view of reality, insofar as one could maybe get that impression from Cassirer's phases, right, of momentary gods, functional gods, personal gods. I think it's been rather clear that from the Kantian or neo-Kantian bent of even someone like Cassirer, that's not the way you should view it. But, insofar as we use that model, for example, in the work of Cassirer following Usener, it's a helpful but ultimately arbitrary periodization, as any periodization will be, in order to understand how the form of life authors the language. Cassirer was influenced by the philosopher Herder, who put forward his own theory of language, that held that the language of a people ought to be seen as an expression of their way of life and therefore of their own worldview. It contains their worldview. But we shouldn't regard the mythic stage of special gods as standing in superiority to the momentary gods. That's what I'm trying to get at. Not even as necessarily representing an increase in complexity. One might also get this idea from Wittgenstein's thought experiments involving the hypothetical builder tribe with their extremely limited set of signifiers. Wittgenstein never intended this thought experiment to describe an actual primitive language. In some sense, he's trying to strip down a hypothetical language to the most basic parameters and show that such a language might still be perfectly adequate to the needs of a given language game. It's the activity that designates the language's needs. So we can't see the builder language that as a primitive language, quote unquote, but as a language that perfectly, adequately reflects the needs that this tribe has. And Cassirer points out that in many so-called primitive cultures, sometimes every step of a given activity is attributed to its own god and has its own name, an activity that we might call by one word. They break up into all these little terms. And even in terms of the grammatical structures, so-called primitive languages can be quite complex. Cassirer writes in Essay on Man, quote, "The languages of uncivilized nations are by no means formless. On the contrary, they exhibit in most cases a very complicated structure. All forms of human speech are perfect, insofar as they succeed in expressing human feelings and thoughts in a clear and appropriate manner. In the language of the Bantu family, for instance, every substantive belongs to a definite class, and every such class is characterized by its specific prefix. These prefixes do not appear only in the nouns themselves, but have to be repeated in accordance with a very complicated system of concords and congruences in all other parts of the sentence which refer to the noun." End quote. We might also think of a rather well-known example. It's a bit of a cliche at this point, but many of the Arctic tribes, such as the Inuits, have many, many words for ice. At least that's how the factoid is normally presented. In actual fact, there are many words that designate many different kinds of ice, right? Ice of differing structural integrity and consistency and smoothness or roughness, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one would have to conclude that, given the way that they live, the setting in which they live, and their necessities, the pressures on their communities, the kinds of activities they engage in, their language games will reflect a higher degree of specificity in designating something that we would all, various things that we would all just group under the class concept ice. It's impossible to say that there's some appropriate amount of specificity regarding a given class of phenomena that has to be reached by a language for it to be now civilized or something like this. It would be just as foolish to call English a less complex language because our sign world for ice is so unspecific. Again, we have to look to the needs of a people, the types of challenges they meet when fulfilling the various objectives that they set for themselves. That's how we'll come to understand the view of the world given in their language. With the infusion of Wittgenstein's philosophy, we can take this model of herders, carried through in the work of Cassirer, and again give it a more dynamic application. Now, with Wittgenstein's insights, we see that a language, as embodying a technique, doesn't just form around a people's overall generalized way of life, but all the different activities that they carry out. We can now conceive of language games that reflect the activities of soldiers, chefs, guitarists, doctors, chess players, any number of activities. So to go back to this point of these successive stages, right, they're a helpful kind of, as I put it earlier, a psychohistorical myth, right? It's not a story of the languages advancing or progressing toward a truer view of the objective world, or even a more complex or more adequate to the task of using or mastering the objective world, because what is that? How do we define using or mastering the objective world, right? There are all sorts of ways of doing that, or ways of interpreting what that would be, as Nietzsche would certainly point out. And at least in the case of Nietzsche, he would also see Cassirer's final stage of mythic thinking, monotheism, the attribution of divinity to the concept of being itself, the predicate of predicates. That's a kind of degradation. It's a misstep in the course of language. In a way, the monotheistic worldview is simply an expression of the many same tendencies that have existed in language and have developed over this long process of objectification. But in the concept of God and the world, universally bound by the directive of a rational intellect, for Nietzsche, the error reaches a kind of apogee. Nietzsche writes in Miscellaneous Maxims and Opinions, number 11, quote, "We are still constantly led astray by words and actions, and are induced to think of things as simpler than they are, as separate, indivisible, existing in the absolute. Language contains a hidden philosophical mythology, which, however careful we may be, breaks out afresh at every moment." End quote. That philosophical mythology, again, clear line to Cassirer there, but it contains these phantasms or deifications of nature, as Nietzsche calls them, and he'll list them off in the Gay Science: line, form, bodies, cause and effect. Often he thinks that these are sort of remnants of the personification of nature, when we saw everything as following from a personified will or being. And again, we often make the mistake of projecting those concepts out into an objective existence when they're actually necessities for us. They're our creative interpretations of the world, that aesthetical mediation between subject and object. But it's interesting that Cassirer sees language as splitting off from myth, right? There's this, that both Nietzsche and Cassirer see a tight correlation between language and myth that doesn't seem to be addressed at all in Wittgenstein's work. But, Cassirer sees man going off and becoming the symbolical animal. His language is dominated by rational discursive style thinking, but the origin of it is so different, and the radical metaphor, the metaphorical transference, is still part of the system. I get the sense with Cassirer there's less of this notion, as with Nietzsche, that the mythic origins, even of our communication, are still sort of determining our thought. There's that famous line where Nietzsche says, "We still believe in God because we have faith in grammar." And that's incredibly interesting to compare with Cassirer's view of these successive stages of language and myth. Nietzsche looks to myth and art as providing the opportunity to once again take hold of that bleeding edge of concept formation, to return to language that is used as flowing magma, not these rigidified, exchangeable concepts deprived of their subjectivity. It is in response to the stultifying effect in our cognition that is visited upon us by monotheism that we get this final form of the herd life expressed in language. And so we should again look to the power of myth and to art to make new dreams and spirits and gods possible. Nietzsche writes, quote, "That drive to form metaphors, that fundamental drive of humanity, which we cannot reckon away for one moment, for we would thereby reckon away humans themselves, is in truth not defeated nor even subdued by the fact that out of its evaporated products, the concepts, a regular and rigid new world has been built as a stronghold for it. This drive seeks for itself a new realm of action and another channel, and finds it in myth and more generally in art. This drive constantly confuses the classifications and cells of concepts by putting up new figures of speech, metaphors, metonymies. It constantly shows its passionate longing for shaping the existing world of waking man as motley, irregular, inconsequentially incoherent, attractive, and eternally new as the world of dreams is." End quote. Wittgenstein, notably, thought that Nietzsche was brilliant, but was somewhat put off by his critiques of Christianity, and probably equally so by his critiques of all of these sort of metaphysical suppositions contained into our language. After all, such a thing would be to ignore the use of the language, or try to in some sense, Nietzsche's entire project of re-legislating how we use language, reevaluating values, is very much not in the spirit of don't think but look, very much not in the spirit of sort of looking at the description, trying to understand in description how language works. Nietzsche is definitely trying to do something new, which is why he's branching off into art and myth, which are the precise things that Cassirer sees sort of at the basis of the process that creates this whole symbolic world. Nietzsche wants to return back to that in order to make a revaluation possible. But the question for Wittgenstein would be, is a revaluation necessary, right? Wittgenstein, for all his logicizing, had a deep reverence for Christianity. It would be difficult to describe him as Christian, but because he didn't practice the religion really, it's even hard to call him a philosophical Christian because he doesn't really even express Christianity in his philosophy. But perhaps he can be seen as partaking of a kind of mystical spirituality inherited from the Christian world, and perhaps in keeping with those values, as Nietzsche would have seen things, he has an appreciation for the everyday, the common, right? The fact that the spiritual truth of Christianity, and indeed many of the world's religions, cannot be spoken, this is a core mystical tenet. Meister Eckhart writes of God as the, quote, "simple ground, the still desert, the simple silence," end quote. This is the God that becomes the being of being, signifying the ground of everything, but thus impossible to describe by any particular attribute. This is why the apophatic tradition arises in theology, which we can see, for example, in the work of Maimonides, in which God is described not by attributing qualities to him, but by making denials, negating all of those things which cannot be said about God, which fall short of describing God. We might also think of the Eastern saying neti neti from the Brahmanic tradition, meaning it's not this, right? Or it's neither this nor that. It's not this, it's not that, right? Sort of implicitly referring to the ultimate reality of the Brahman. Nothing you can say about it can really come close. Ernst Cassirer writes in Language and Myth, quote, "All mysticism is directed toward a world beyond language, a world of silence. It is speech itself which prepares the way for that last step, whereby it is transcended." End quote. Ultimately, the differences between Nietzsche, the radical pagan, Cassirer, the Enlightenment humanist, and Wittgenstein, the mystical logician, they're differences that can be understood through the competing ethical agendas pursued by these three thinkers. Wittgenstein would have probably said that here the three could argue for an eternity and never come to an agreement as to which ethical judgments are the right ones. Perhaps such disputes really are just linguistic misunderstandings. There may be many more similarities that one could elucidate among this trio, but I would argue that when we expand our perspective beyond their remarks on language, I think what we find is that they diverge in wildly different directions, and it's what makes their convergence on these issues concerning language all the more striking, as I argued at the beginning, because they think in such radically different ways, but there's this convergence here at this point. And in spite of their differing valuations, all three have a respect for what can't be said, the world beyond language. Perhaps for different reasons, right? But the world of silence that Cassirer just described, that sort of comes to us at this final stage of language, is the transcendence of language. A very interesting idea. Just as Wittgenstein famously argued against the idea that language could convey inner experience, Nietzsche too argued that what is in our depths remains entirely incommunicable, singular, inexchangeable. And so alongside that quote from Cassirer on silence, I'd like to offer two more by his two companions. Wittgenstein's remark is by far the most famous in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, quote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent," end quote. We've all heard that one, right? But I was delighted when I found a kind of Nietzschean inversion of this quote in a way in the 1886 preface to Human All Too Human, Volume 2, which expresses almost the same thing, but from another angle. It reflects perhaps that differing attitude. We might say the different sentimentality governing Nietzsche. Quote, "One should only speak where one cannot remain silent, and only speak of what one has conquered," end quote. So in Nietzsche's words, we find he gives a rule not for when one should refrain from speaking, but for when one cannot refrain from speaking. So Wittgenstein is saying if you find you can't speak about something, you can't make intelligible statements of it, you should remain silent. Nietzsche is saying when you cannot keep yourself from remaining silent, the statements you make are in some sense warranted by that alone, by the drive to speak. Perhaps then, in the way of summary of this synthetic theory, I will offer the following. We have sketched out a story involving the interaction and intersection of commands, symbols, and games as ways of looking at language. The command is what is made possible by the language. It's the driving necessity that pushes its development along. The command is man's primary weapon against the natural world. And we don't just mean literal commands. It's with the command that we rank order, we organize, we volatilize our fleeting perceptions into a schema in which the signs for those perceptions can become ordered. If the need for the command is the object of this driving activity, the symbol is its basis. The symbol is its material. It is the backdrop against which the potential to command, to organize, and rank order can take place. Man is a symbolical animal, and his symbolizing activities follow in accord with the expanding sphere of human activities and necessities. And the nature of that expanding sphere can be understood as the language game, the use to which our symbols are put, and the objectives that the commands facilitate are the forms of life that language embodies. What we have here is a story about how forms of life create language. Language contains a view of life. It's creative of a view of life. And therefore, indirectly speaking, we might come to a somewhat facile claim that it's the form of life that produces the worldview. Indirectly speaking, through the language, and through, which is, again, to say a very deceptively simple statement, right? Because this is there are so many puzzles and challenges in understanding how this could have happened. But I think with this synthesis, we can move beyond a rigid schema in which there's a linear course of development, or in which different languages reflect the life simply of a people or a nation, into a dynamic view in which all the techniques, customs, and group activities of man give birth to new forms of linguistic expression. Language thus stands as a powerful force of organization, birthed out of the metaphor, the compression of perception, and even magical thinking. But it's now completely debased of all such emotional and subjective content, such that the rational person will scarcely believe that the metaphor is the grandmother of his concepts. We can use these powers of logic, of objectivity, of the apparent fixity of phenomena for a great many purposes. It vastly expands our powers. But alas, we now live in a symbolical world, for better or for worse. Man begins to perceive even reality itself through this system of symbols, having forgotten that that this very system was there to facilitate commanding, which is to say valuing, setting the rules for the game, we might say, doing things in the world, our expanding spheres of human activity. Our conceptual schemata were created, in other words, for the mastery of nature, or for the mastery of ourselves as formerly impulsive beings, and for the organization and facilitation of the vastest variety of goals and activities. Where we have perhaps met with the greatest confusion in philosophical inquiry is when we have begun to regard these word concepts as giving us the right to see right into, quote-unquote, the real world, an order of things which we think is ready-made according to the laws of nature. And with that error, there comes a subsequent prejudice that everything real, everything of worth, could be expressed in language. But that wasn't the power that the word concept could give us to model reality. I've been stressing this point throughout this entire time, but it comes back here with this question of silence. I mean, again, we might wonder what would remain of our so-called real world without the element of human creativity that makes it intelligible to us, which is to say that makes the external world into something that we can use. In fact, much remains within our depth that can never be said. And that's precisely why I wanted to emphasize the point of silence at the end, because that is always the thing that tends to be forgotten. The possibility of thinking or even knowledge, independent of language. The possibility of particularity of our spirit, peculiarity of our spirit that can never be expressed. The possibility of mystical truths, or the glimpse of the truth with a capital T, all of these things, in some sense, standing out aside from language. And whenever philosophers, the moral realists or the naive realists regarding the phenomenal world, or objectivists, or all these people, absolutists, dogmatists, as Nietzsche would have called them, want to turn language into something that can bind the whole world, it's just a misunderstanding of what it is. And in some very important sense, I would say, does violence to our depths by trying to fish it out and bring it up to the surface of the world of consciousness and conscious communication, the sign world, force it, contort it into the Procrustean bed of the sign, the signifier. I think all three of these thinkers are very much aware of the value of silence and the value of what's in our depth and what can't be said, even as they all see that the symbolical world, this creation of our own, that's the way that we're able to use the world, to take mastery over it, and indeed take mastery over even ourselves. But we have to always remember the value of silence. That's all for this week, everyone. Thank you for joining me. We have a 2-part episode coming up that's going to end season 6. I can't believe we're already here at the end. Next week, we're finally going to talk about one of the strangest books I have ever read in my entire life, and that is Georges Bataille on Nietzsche. And the title might lead you to believe the book is something other than it really is. Not that it's not about Nietzsche, it certainly is, and we're going to talk about that, but it's so much more than that. And again, it's very strange. So I'm very excited about that. And if you are as well, then please join me then for the 2-part season finale of the Nietzsche Podcast. Thanks, everybody. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.